today we've seen a landmark judgment by the Supreme Court of India where 9 judges in a huge constitutional bench have sat together and said that Indian citizens have a fundamental right to privacy. Now, what exactly does that mean for us? That's something which is going to be debated, discussed, analyzed in the days and months and years to come. The big question, obviously, which is why this case even started, was, is the Aadhaar program constitutional? Because it was challenged before the courts that the Aadhaar program violates the rights of Indian citizens to privacy, because it takes your biometric information, takes your iris scan, it takes all of this information which is deeply personal to you, and it takes it and it's putting it on a database, and it is making it mandatory to have that, to give over that information for you to avail of public and private services. So this is what the entire reason why this case came up to the Supreme Court was. But the Supreme Court judgment, to clarify, is not about Aadhaar here. It is only about whether Indian citizens do have a fundamental right to privacy. It now has to go back to the courts which were hearing the challenges to Aadhaar to decide whether or not Aadhaar is constitutional and whether it doesn't violate the right to privacy. And the big question on everyone's lips is what happens to Aadhaar. Now, according to the government, in fact, nothing happens to Aadhaar, because the government says that, what the Supreme Court has said today doesn't affect anything which we've been doing so far. We've kind of accepted that there is a fundamental right to privacy already, and we've fulfilled that requirement by bringing in the Aadhaar Act in 2016, which brings in a legislation which governs how Aadhaar is used. It's a bit funny that the government actually has come up and said this, because we can see on the record of what was said in court over the hearings which were concluded today, that the government came up and said, actually there is no fundamental right to privacy. You may have a right to privacy which is a common law right, which the government can take away whenever it wants. You don't have a fundamental right to privacy in the Constitution. They said certain aspects may be protected by the Constitution, but those fall within other rights, and there's no fundamental right to privacy. Now, this was very, very expressly said by the government in court. So for Ravi Shankar Prasad, the law minister and the IT minister, to come up today and say, actually we've never said that there's a problem with privacy being a fundamental right, is a bit rich. There's a reason why obviously the government's doing it, is because they're trying to ensure that they come out on the front foot defending Aadhaar and saying that despite what the Supreme Court has said today, Aadhaar is still a legitimate program. Now, what is the basis on which we would actually analyze this? The Supreme Court has said that privacy as a fundamental right is mainly located within Article 21 of the Constitution, which is the right to life and personal liberty. It also says that it's located within Part 3 of the Constitution, in the other articles there, which deal with your other fundamental rights as well, such as the right to freedom of speech, the right to practice your religion, the right to freedom of conscience. Now, when trying to decide whether something violates this, and in this case whether the Aadhaar Act would violate this procedure, we have to look at a number of tests. So the test for Article 21 violations is what's being claimed to violate the fundamental right. Has it been brought in through a proper law? Which is yes, we've seen the Aadhaar Act come in 2016. But more importantly, is this law just, fair and reasonable? That is the test which has to be applied. Now, the government has tried to come out today and say, look, what we've done is entirely just, fair and reasonable, and therefore we're entirely in accordance with what the Supreme Court has said. But that's not necessarily true, because when we're trying to decide whether something is just, fair and reasonable, it's not just about have we actually put down a law which says it, it's is that law doing something which actually legitimately protects state interests, and B, is it proportional? Now, the government says that, look, we need Aadhaar because we need to try and ensure that our welfare programs are efficient. We need to ensure that we're able to ensure that there's no dissipation of what should be public distributed funds. So on that basis, that's the reason why we need Aadhaar to be mandatory for everything, from the public distribution system, to your tax returns, to your PAN card, to mobile phone numbers in your bank account these days. There may be a legitimate state interest in ensuring that funds don't get dissipated. Is this a proportional way to achieve that? And the fact that the Supreme Court has clarified that that is required is something which is where Aadhaar is possibly going to run into a lot of challenges. And we got an inkling of that in Justice Nariman's judgment today, where he specifically raised doubts about how proportional it is in the exercise of trying to bring about welfare programs to collect this vast amount of data and mandatorily apply it for all sorts of public services. So we've already seen a little bit of a taster of what kind of questions Aadhaar is going to be put to when it goes back to the Supreme Court judges who are going to be deciding on its validity. While Article 21 restrictions can be brought in a slightly more easier way with just that sort of legitimate proportionate test, when it comes to other fundamental rights, the restrictions are a lot more stringent. And that's something which will also now be used yet again in courts to take on Aadhaar. Do we know what the outcome is going to be? Well, we can't be entirely sure. If the reasoning of the judges follows something similar to what Justice Nariman said today, well, you could probably see Aadhaar not being struck down as a whole as being unconstitutional, but definitely in terms of Aadhaar being made mandatory for a number of different services, it is quite possible that we'll see it failing the test of constitutionality, which it needs to fit in, given that privacy is a fundamental right.